Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Low Oxalate Kitchen podcast, where the goal is to make a low oxalate diet more simple and accessible for anyone looking to follow it. This is episode number 6. I'm your host, Vincent Salento, and this is part 2 of a chat that I had with registered dietitian Melanie Betz. If you haven't listened to the first episode, definitely check that out if you get the chance. You don't necessarily have to listen to them in order, but if you do, it might give you a bit more context for what I talked about with her today. The first episode with Melanie, who you can find at thekidneydietitian.org, was all about the effects of protein and sugar on the formation and prevention of calcium oxalate kidney stones. This conversation covers the other 2 main dietary considerations that you should take into account if you're looking to prevent stones, and they are dietary sodium and dietary calcium. So there's a lot of good stuff packed into this episode, including a couple of recipes from Melanie's new e-cookbook, which you can find on her site, and we'll have a link in the show notes to that as well. The ebook is, like these 2 episodes, focused on the prevention of calcium oxalate stones, so it includes about 30 recipes that are all low in sodium, sugar, they have moderate protein, sufficient calcium, and are all low to medium oxalate. Melanie gives the nutrition facts for each of those recipes, so all of your macros are in there, as well as an estimated oxalate amount per serving. Please note the keywords in that phrase, per serving. This is something I try and emphasize whenever I get the chance. When you get the ebook, you might notice one higher oxalate ingredient in some of those recipes. One of those examples is cumin. This is usually referred to as a high oxalate food, but foods are only really high or low in oxalate when compared to a serving size. So if you eat a tablespoon of cumin, that would probably most certainly be high oxalate. But if you add a teaspoon or 2 into a pot of chili that makes 12 servings, the cumin's not really going to add a significant amount of oxalate to your meal, unless, of course, you decide to eat the whole pot. So just use the recommended amount. You can cut it in half if you want, but either way, if you divide it up into 10 or 12 servings, it's not going to add a significant amount. One of the other things you might see in there are tiny portions of things like walnuts, which, like the cumin, does not add a crazy amount of oxalate if you're only putting a tablespoon and it's just something that you're throwing on top of yogurt or something like that just for a little crunch. It's not going to add too much oxalate to that serving size. If you see something like oats or brown rice in one of the recipes, there are some lower oxalate substitutions that you can use, like parboiled or quick oats, or white rice, or parboiled brown rice. Parboiling in the case of oats and rice, because there's a high percentage of soluble oxalate in both of those things, it will remove some of the oxalates. So same as before, just take it easy on the serving size if you're worried about too much oxalate in those instances. The recipes in this cookbook are also perfectly balanced with low sodium, like I said, low sugar. They're moderate protein, they have sufficient calcium, and they're so balanced in those respects that if a couple of them are medium oxalate, they're highly unlikely to contribute to calcium oxalate stones. So Melanie's a specialist in dietetics specifically for kidney stone patients, and I've looked over each recipe myself, and I'm more than confident that she did an incredible job with this ebook. So I highly recommend getting it if you're struggling to find some good recipes or just looking for some new meal ideas. You can find a link to it in the show notes. It's lowoxalatekitchen.com/podcast, or you can check out Melanie's site, thekidneydietitian.org. Be sure to follow Melanie on Instagram. She's at the Kidney Dietitian with a couple dots in there, the.kidney.dietitian. If you like this episode and want to leave a review wherever you're listening, that would be great. And we welcome any and all feedback as well. You can send a message to me or to Melanie on Instagram or on Facebook. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy this round 2 with Melanie Betz. All right, Melanie, welcome back.
Thanks for having me again, Vincent.
Yeah. So the last time we talked about protein and sugar and how they affect the formation and prevention of kidney stones. So I want to give a little refresher to everyone, maybe see if we can package it up a little bit differently. So fill in any blanks that you hear, or if you disagree, let me know.
I'll do my best.
All right. Yeah. So it seems to me that there's really three main things that you should start doing if you find out you have calcium oxalate stones. The first one, the most obvious, is reducing the concentration of calcium and oxalate in the urine. And we talked about that last time, about getting in enough water, making sure you're producing, was it 2 or 2.5 liters of urine per day?
Yep, producing 2.5 liters, which means drinking about 3 liters for most people.
Okay. So a lot of people with kidney stones know they should be doing that. It's kind of the first thing the doctor tells you when you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then, so if the first thing is reducing the concentration of calcium and oxalate, what you should do after that is reduce the amount of oxalate, right? And that's why people are following the low oxalate diet. But the part of that people sort of tend to overlook is reducing the amount of calcium also in the urine. Mm-hmm. So that's why we talked about the sugar and protein last time, because they tend to increase the amount of calcium in the urine. And that's also a very important factor.
Yes. Kind of everything else besides the oxalate piece is all about reducing calcium in the urine. And really that calcium in the urine is the biggest driver of kidney stone formation for most people. And so, everything, the sugar that we talked about last time, and the protein, and also the salt that we'll talk about today, all has to do with that calcium.
Do we know why calcium is the biggest driver, or how they sort of came to that conclusion?
I don't exactly know from a chemical standpoint why exactly calcium is the biggest driver. I think they just, from kind of doing epidemiological studies, they know that the higher the calcium, the more likely the formation of kidney stones, whereas that association with oxalate isn't necessarily as strong.
Gotcha. Mm-hmm. Okay. I thought I read somewhere that it might have to do with like just the actual quantities of calcium and oxalate in the urine per day.
Yeah. That makes sense. So like you're saying that there's more calcium in the urine compared to oxalate?
I guess, yeah, I couldn't remember which one it was. I guess because there's so much more calcium in the urine per day on average that it's, smarter to focus on that, I guess, than as opposed to the oxalate, right?
Yeah. And I think that might come from the fact that the problem for most people, and this is true just in my practice that I've seen, for most people, the problem isn't that we have too much oxalate. The problem is we have way too much calcium. So that just tends to be a more common piece of the equation that is off in people, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's still important to reduce oxalate, because if you have as little as possible or none, then there's nothing for the calcium to bind with, but also very important to make sure you're taking into account the amount of calcium that ends up in the urine. And that's different from the amount of calcium that you're getting from the diet, because one doesn't necessarily...
We'll talk all about today.
Right. All right. So maybe we should start with that. We'll start with calcium, and maybe we'll just start with the recommended daily value, how much it is it the same for everyone, and how that sort of works.
Yeah, absolutely. So calcium is important for people with calcium oxalate stones for two reasons. And I know that this is super counterintuitive, because I just spent all this time telling you that you want to reduce how much calcium is in your urines, but now I'm going to tell you to eat more calcium. Mm-hmm. But the reason that we care so much about it is twofold. So the first part is because calcium binds oxalate in the intestine. So if you eat oxalate, and there's going to be some oxalate in your diet, it would be impossible and unhealthy to totally cut it out. You literally would be eating meat or something, but that wouldn't be healthy either.
Which some people do.
That's true. That is not recommended, especially for kidney stones.
Right.
But anyway, so So the reason that we like calcium for people with calcium oxalate stones is because it binds that oxalate in the intestine, which just like it binds it in your kidneys as well, and then it forms a kidney stone. But instead, if you eat calcium with your food that has oxalate, it will bind in the intestines, and then you'll just poop out that oxalate, which is great. And instead of that oxalate getting absorbed into your body and eventually excreted in your urine. So that is the first reason. And then the second reason is because people with calcium stones are actually at much higher risk of osteoporosis and weak bones. We know that people with kidney stones are much more likely to have bone fractures in their life, which of course is just indication that their bones are weaker. We don't fully understand why this is. Like, it has to do with the fact that for whatever reason, people who make kidney stones, their body just desperately wants to keep their urine calcium high for whatever reason. It's perhaps genetic, your diet plays into that, but for whatever reason, your body just really wants to keep that urine calcium high, and it does that by stealing calcium from your bones, which is unfortunate for them. And so it's to kind of help counteract your body stealing all of this calcium from your bones to excrete in your urine. It is really important to make sure that your diet does have calcium in it, in order to replenish and keep those bones as healthy as possible. So again, those two reasons is binding oxalate in the intestine and helping to protect your bones.
Gotcha. So, is there a recommendation for how much calcium you should get from the diet per day?
Yes, absolutely. So you want it to be somewhere between 1,000 to 1,200 milligrams per day. So as long as you're in that range, then you're good. If you break that down into what actual food looks like, that equates to about 3 servings of dairy per day. 1 glass of milk or like 1 serving of yogurt has about 300 milligrams. So if you consider like 900 or so from dairy plus a handful of calcium from other foods, because there are certainly other foods that have bits of calcium, that will be a good way to make sure that you're getting enough.
Is that the same for men and women, and the same for younger versus older people, or how does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the recommended amount of calcium for people with kidney stones is actually the same as what's recommended for all people who are healthy. It's just maybe especially important that people with kidney stones get in calcium. So, basically, the recommendation is 1,000 milligrams for all adults, but it does increase to 1,200 milligrams for women at the age of 51, and that sort of aligns with menopause. And then it increases at 71 to that 1,200 milligrams per day for everyone. So basically 1,000 milligrams across the board, unless you're a woman over the age of 51, or a man over the age of 71.
Do we know why it increases for everyone at 71, or are older people more prone to having calcium pulled from the bones and into the urine also?
No, not necessarily, because that's just the recommendation for everyone. I think it probably just reflects the fact that your bones, um, really everyone's bones, are starting to deteriorate after the age of about 25, actually. That tends to be the age of peak bone health. And so I think that the way that they create the RDAs is just trying to determine the best amount at different ages. And so I think just because everyone's bones are at risk when you get to be that age, it's important that everyone gets more calcium.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we talked about vitamin D a little bit last time, and most of the United States, at least, is deficient in vitamin D.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that
Yes.
doesn't come naturally, I guess, from a typical American diet. Is
Mm-hmm.
calcium something that's in the same boat there, or do most people that are on a standard American diet get enough calcium?
Yeah. Most people do not get enough calcium. Yeah. We just don't. I mean, it's sort of difficult to get enough calcium because a lot of people are not drinking milk. I think milk has sort of been demonized for whatever reason.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, most people are not. getting adequate calcium, and certainly not from dairy, like I said. And for people with kidney stones, whenever possible, I do recommend cow's milk dairy over other sources, just because dairy doesn't have oxalate in it. So, for example, like I feel like kale is always sort of the notorious example for a vegetable that has calcium in it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it does, but that kale also has at least some oxalate, and so it's not going to do as good of a job binding extra oxalate in that meal, which is, like I said, kind of half the reason why we're pushing this calcium so hard. So yes, so that's one reason why, if wherever possible, I recommend trying to get it from like good old milk,
Mm-hmm.
if possible. Yeah.
Right. I wish ice cream didn't have so much sugar in it,
I
because then you could kind
know.
of use
I
that
know.
instead.
Ice cream is my very favorite dessert, so that's
Yep.
a hard point you bring up.
um, so if people aren't incorporating dairy, there are some vegetables that, like you said, like kale and others that do have some calcium. There's chickpeas, black-eyed peas, collard greens are all low oxalate, and do
Hmm.
have some calcium.
Yep.
But for those people who can't have dairy, do you recommend supplementing with calcium to get to
Yeah.
the recommended daily amount?
Yeah, I mean, it's really specific for different people, but sort of as a last resort, we do recommend calcium supplements. When again as a last resort, and the reason that we don't go to those first, because I mean that would be way easier for everyone probably,
Right.
is if we just said take a calcium supplement, but there is some research to show that calcium from supplements actually increases the amount of calcium in your urine more than naturally occurring calcium, which is of course kind of what we're trying to stop from happening. So but that being said, the benefit does outweigh the risk for supplements. So if there's no other way to get in adequate calcium, we do calcium supplements.
Hmm. I wonder if those studies took into account the timing of the supplements, if they were taken with meals or in between. Do you know?
Hmm. I do not know, but that brings up a really good point that I was going to mention, is that the timing of your calcium, either from supplements or from food, does matter quite a bit. So you really want to make sure that you're timing your calcium supplement or your milk or dairy or yogurt or whatever, with your meals, because if you take, if you're getting in your 3 servings of dairy, but you're using it as a snack, for example, like you're having yogurt as a snack, that nice salad that you had for lunch with all that oxalate is going to get absorbed, and the calcium isn't there to stop that oxalate from getting absorbed. So timing is a super important factor.
Right. Okay. So do you have any tips to incorporate dairy into meals if people say they don't want to have a glass of milk with each meal, or with less of them? Is there other ways to sort of sneak it in there to make sure that you're getting the calcium with your meals?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually just came out with a new cookbook, that you can get on my website that addresses that exact question. I came up with 30 or 31 recipes that incorporate either yogurt or milk or other, primarily those two, but other sources of dairy too, into recipes. So, for example, like one of them is an Indian curry. It's a chicken curry, and there's yogurt in it. And there's actually enough in 1 serving of curry to be your whole dairy serving for that meal. So yeah, I think, I know that just drinking milk on the side can get really boring, and so I think there are definitely creative ways to incorporate it into the meal so it doesn't just feel like you're drinking milk all day.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, we'll
Mhm.
definitely have a link to the ebook in the show notes for anyone listening who wants to check it out. Can you give us maybe one more example, one more like little teaser?
Sure. Yeah, so my other favorite recipe, I don't know if I have to say my favorite. My favorite recipe is the panna cotta recipe in my dessert section. But another great way to sneak in calcium is ricotta flatbread. I discovered that ricotta is a gold mine because it's very low in sodium and super duper high in calcium. So it's a great thing to incorporate. But I used it as a sauce or cheese for a flatbread pizza. So I just took a pita bread and put some ricotta on it, and then put some roasted vegetables. I think the ones that I used in my cookbook are zucchini and red onion with garlic, maybe some other things. So, but yeah, there's lots of different ways that you can get in dairy, so it doesn't have to feel like you're just drinking milk all the time.
Yeah, for sure. That sounds delicious.
Yeah.
Also very interested in the panna cotta recipe.
Yes, it's very good. When you mentioned ice cream, I immediately thought of that. It's
Yeah.
not ice cream, but it's a pretty good substitute.
Yeah. Cool. And
Yeah.
then, so you mentioned ricotta cheese also, and how it's very low in sodium, but also high in calcium. I actually
Hmm.
wrote an article about the different kinds of cheese and like sort of did a comparison of the ratios of sodium to calcium.
Oh,
So
nice.
yeah,
Yeah, I'll
so
have
if
to check that out.
yeah, so I'll put a link to that too for anyone who's interested. Ricotta cheese is probably the best one, and then Swiss cheese is a close second. It's
Hmm.
usually low in sodium and usually pretty high in calcium.
Hmm. Fresh mozzarella tends to be a good one too.
Yep, for sure. There's
Hmm. Hmm.
for some reason they really vary like between brand and even like within some brands for some reason. I don't
Yeah,
know. Yeah,
the
I don't know
mozzarella
why.
does.
Yeah, the fresh mozzarella. Like
Hmm.
I looked one time. I was in the grocery store for like an hour or two taking pictures of cheese, like a crazy
Doing your
person
homework.
doing my homework. Yeah. And there was this one brand of fresh mozzarella that had uh, like they had a like a regular kind of log, and then they had
Hmm.
a smaller one, and then like a couple different shapes, and they were all the same brand, all the same cheese, all the same label, just different shapes, and for some reason they had different levels of sodium and calcium on them,
Yeah,
and I couldn't
it's
figure
so
it out.
crazy.
I think I sent the company an email, but I don't think they ever got back to me.
Yeah.
Moral of the story: when you're picking cheese, if you want sort of the best one for kidney stones and oxalates, if you find one with a percentage of calcium around 15% or over, then that's very good. And
Hmm.
then if the sodium is less than 5 or around 5% of the daily value, then that's pretty good. Most of
That'd be
them are,
great.
yeah,
Hmm.
most of them are middle of the road, and
Yeah.
have, I think, 8% or 9, like around in that range for sodium, and sort of in the
Hmm.
same range for calcium. But like the bigger difference between the two on the label, the better.
Yeah.
Is there anything else about calcium that we didn't touch on that you think we should?
The one other thing that I wanted to mention in my book, I actually there's an introduction kind of as to why calcium is so important in a calcium oxalate stone diet. But I also give some tips for helping deal with lactose intolerance because I know that's something that a lot of people deal with. And sort of my general tips is if that is something that you struggle with, is really trying to start with yogurt and cheese and not necessarily milk, just because there's less lactose in both yogurt and cheese because the process of making it, the bacteria eat up some of that lactose. So a lot of times people who can't tolerate normal, just like cow's milk, do okay with yogurt. Um, and then the other thing that I like to mention is to start slow, just because if you all of a sudden go from eating like 0 to 1 servings of dairy per day up to three, a lot of people deal with constipation, which is not great.
Right.
And so really starting slow to both prevent constipation as well as help with that lactose intolerance because your body actually can upregulate the lactase enzyme, which of course metabolizes lactose, which is pretty cool. So your body stopped making it if you stop eating dairy because it didn't need it, but you can help your body upregulate it by slowly incorporating that dairy again.
Very interesting. Yeah, I
Hmm.
know that hopefully that helps some people out there, because I know a lot of people who are following a low oxalate diet, if it's not for kidney stones, or even if it is, they also have some other stuff that they're dealing with, and a lot of them
Hmm.
feel the need to cut out dairy amongst other things. So if that's
Hmm.
something that people can reincorporate a little bit slowly, like you said, then that could be
Hmm.
very helpful for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, everyone's different. It's not going to work for everyone, but worth a shot.
Right. Definitely.
Hmm.
Cool. All right, so let's move on to sodium. This is sort of the last in the group of 4 things that we're going to talk about
Hmm.
that all affect stone formation and prevention. Talk to me about how sodium relates to kidney stones and why we sort of have to be careful how much we eat.
Yeah, sodium's a tough one. So the biggest reason is when you eat a lot of salt, then that equates to lots of calcium in your urine. That's kind of the down and dirty of it. But the reason that is, if you want to get nerdy, and I know that you like doing that, Vincent,
That would be great.
is that is that the way that your kidneys get rid of sodium, it basically needs some calcium to do that. And so, like on sort of a molecular level. And so,
Mhm.
the more sodium that you eat, the more sodium your kidneys have to get rid of. So, the more calcium your kidneys need, which then, of course, increases your risk of stones and puts your bones at more risk as well. So,
Okay.
there's your quick chemistry lesson.
Yep. You don't want to go deeper and talk about sodium, potassium pumps and all that sort of,
No, I
no?
don't.
All
That's my line.
right. So, exactly how much sodium then is sort of recommended?
Yeah, so somewhere between 1,500 and 2,300. If you can get down to 2,300 milligrams a day, you're doing awesome. The average American, estimates vary, but the average American eats somewhere between 4 to 6,000 milligrams. So most of us have a lot of work to do.
Hmm.
Sodium is just so prevalent in a lot of the foods that we eat. And so it really takes some effort and thought and cooking skills for a lot of people to help get that sodium down.
Yeah, and that's something you have to watch out for. If you're not cooking the majority of your meals, then the chances are you're probably having too much sodium
Yeah,
because it's very
likely,
popular.
yeah.
And yeah, it's popular in restaurants if you're
Hmm.
going out to eat, and if you're having already prepared stuff to keep it fresh, they sort of add a little bit more sodium in there too. So it's
Hmm.
sort of the opposite of vitamin D and calcium, like we were talking about, where it's sort of hard to meet the recommended amount, and then
Yeah, sodium's definitely the opposite. And I think it's really interesting to note that around 80% of the salt that we eat is already in our food. I think 95% of the patients that I see when I start talking about low sodium, they say, "Oh no, like I don't add salt to my food. I'm okay." But that's not the case, obviously, because most of the salt is already in things. It's already in the chicken broth or that restaurant meal. That's a big one, or those processed chips, or that barbecue sauce, or that ketchup, or
hmm,
that commercial veggie burger. Whatever it is.
right.
There's just a lot of salt in that processed food that they already add, and there actually is room to add a little bit of salt when you're cooking if you are cooking from fresh non-processed ingredients. You definitely have room to do that if you're doing it right.
Hmm. All right. So while we're on the topic of cooking your own meals and making sure you don't add or get too much salt in the diet by cooking your own meals, do you have any tips
Hmm.
for low sodium cooking?
Sure. Don't be afraid to add lots of herbs and spices, right? Because the probably the biggest complaint when people start working on taking salt out of their food is that food doesn't taste very good and it's sort of bland, which is fair because most of us are used to eating a lot more salt than we need. Um, and fun side fact is that your taste buds actually change once you take the salt out of your diet or once you reduce it. And so if I hear this all the time, patients work really hard and they're doing a great job, and then they happen to go out for a meal or for whatever reason eat something really salty that they used to eat all the time, and they say it tastes really gross. They say it's like literally like ocean water. So there's sort of a learning phase with the low sodium thing. Like food will probably not taste very good for a couple weeks, but then after a while you'll kind of start to get used to it, um, which I think is sort of cool. But yeah, so my two biggest tips for low sodium cooking is to use herbs and spices like crazy. Basically, any of them are completely fine. I know that some of them technically have high oxalate, but the amount that you're going to use realistically in a recipe is not going to contribute any significant amount. Black pepper is kind of a good example. I think maybe we talked about that last time, or I know that you did with a previous podcast guest. Um, so So any dried herb and spice, fresh
Hmm.
herbs and spices. You can use mixes like Mrs. Dash is certainly the most popular, but there's lots of salt-free seasonings out there these days. But do be careful with those mixes. A lot of them, like Italian blend or like grill seasoning, or those a lot of those mixes do have salt added to them. So just be careful that you know what you're buying. A good example is lemon pepper. Like Lori's lemon pepper actually has a surprising amount of salt in it, which is crazy. It's not just lemon and pepper. So just really,
Hmm.
as always, read food labels with your spices. Um, so yeah, so that's my first recommendation. And then my second one is to get used to using acid. That is my favorite trick to add lots of flavor to food. And when I say acid, I primarily mean vinegar or lemon and lime juice. Those are the two that I use most often. So like, there's so many fancy vinegars out there, like balsamic vinegar, red wine. I bought the most amazing blueberry vinegar in Saugatuck, Michigan, a couple summers ago. That was a great salad dressing just by itself. But you can use those things to really brighten up your food. Just throw it in at the end, and it adds tons of flavor. So, like at the end of cooking soup, drizzle some red wine vinegar in there, and that will add a lot of flavor. After you cook your chicken, put some fresh lemon juice on it. Using vinegar for salad dressing, that's sort of an obvious one, but there's lots of different uses for that acid to really help up the flavor of your food.
Yeah, for sure. And for anyone who hasn't listened to episode 4, I believe, of the podcast, I talked to a chef. Her name is Alexandra Cleanthus. I don't know if you heard that episode, but she taught everyone how to infuse their own oils, and also,
Oh,
yeah, how to make your own pickles. And we also talked a little bit about making your own vinegars. Also, she sort of like walks you through the process for each of
nice.
those. Yeah, I actually just made my first batch of pickles like 2 days ago, so I'm gonna wait a couple days and try them out. Hopefully they come out good.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I love pickles. I always have dills in my refrigerator.
Yep. And then you also mentioned getting used to lower sodium foods, like your palate sort of adjusts over time,
Hmm.
and that's also true with sugary foods. And I've sort of like this has happened to me a little bit over time. I'm not where I want to be yet. I'm hoping that it gets better, because a lot of the desserts that I eat out now, they do taste very sweet, but not to the
Mm-hmm.
point where they're too sweet where I won't eat a lot of them.
You'll still
So
figure out a way.
yeah, I'm hoping to get better with the sugar, and also get to that point with the salt, because there's just,
Hmm.
sometimes you just, there could be a ton of salt on something and you don't even notice.
Oh, yeah.
The other thing you mentioned with herbs and spices, to use those instead of salt. If you can't find any that are low in salt or low in oxalate, keep an eye out, because myself and one of the guests I had on, her name is Napur. She's also a chef close to me right here in New York, and she makes her own spice blends. And we're talking about working on one together. She just sent me a couple samples, and we're doing a little taste test, and mixing and matching. So hopefully we'll have, in the next maybe month or a couple months, our own custom low oxalate kitchen spice blends. And they'll probably all be no salt or very low in salt, if they do have any.
Yeah. How cool.
Yeah, keep an eye out for that if you're interested. So we talk about low sodium cooking a little bit. What about when you're eating out? Because that's part of life, and part of, even though it's
Certainly.
enjoyable, part of the struggle for some people. So do you have any tips for, eating out
Hmm.
and making sure that you're getting low sodium meals when you're out?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you certainly can still eat out, and you should still eat out. It would make me so sad to know that anyone just said, I'm never going to a restaurant again, because that's life, and we should be able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I think it kind of depends on the type of restaurant you're going to. Like if you're on a road trip and you know that you're going to stop at a McDonald's and that's just what you got, you just kind of have to work with that. I think planning ahead, so before you even get there, go and bring up the nutrition information online, especially if you're going to like a chain like McDonald's or Panera or something like that. And do your homework and put together a meal that it is as low sodium as possible. And it is really important to look at the nutrition information, because you can't really guess which items have the most salt. Because like you mentioned, you really can't taste it necessarily.
Right.
So I think doing your homework and planning ahead for those situations. And if you're at sort of a fancier restaurant where they would be willing and able to make something special for you, like don't be afraid to ask for that. Restaurants, especially these days, are used to every restricted diet under the sun. And if you have kidney stones, you have an actual medical reason
Mm-hmm.
for not eating salt or keeping it low. So don't be afraid to ask that your food be prepared without salt as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Some general tips: avoiding anything with breading. That breading tends to have quite a bit of salt, so anything that's like deep fried, of course. Asking for dressing on the side or sauces on the side, and then you can add just a little bit, because you never know if that salad comes totally drenched, then you can't really take off that dressing. But then if it comes on the side, then you have control over that. Same thing with like cheese on salads or other ingredients that you know are going to be super salty. You can ask for them on the side and you can add just a little bit. So then your food is still delicious, but you're just being careful with how much salt is in there. Being really careful with your sides. So maybe, like Vincent, you mentioned, I think that you really love hamburgers. So maybe you just really, really need to have that hamburger, which you know is just going to be a salty meal. But then maybe you don't have the fries on the side, and that's sort of a balance that you make, and you can get a side salad, or I don't know, maybe you could get a side of steamed broccoli or something. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
At that restaurant, and just trying to look at the whole meal, and put together something that's as low sodium as you can.
Right. Um, so
Hmm.
this is something I can sort of weigh in a little bit on too, because I've worked in restaurants for forever. And it's
Yeah.
if you're adding or if you want to have them not add salt, that really shouldn't. It kind of sounds weird, but it really shouldn't be an issue. There was actually one restaurant I worked at where we had sort of a button on the computer already. Like they already have the common ones, like if you want a side of ranch or no pickles or whatever, that sort of stuff is built into the
Hmm.
computer system because they're common. And at one of the restaurants we had, there was a button for no salt, or just
Oh,
leave off the
nice.
salt. Yeah, so it's not
Hmm.
it's not that crazy. One or two tips for that: just be not overly nice, but a little bit extra nice to your server when you do ask. It's no problem at all to ask. The problem comes when people are sort of rude about it, or um,
Yeah.
so just be nice. And then if you want to add a couple dollars extra for the tip, don't be afraid to go ahead and do that.
Hmm.
There was something else you mentioned also. Oh, for the burgers, I definitely do love burgers. And fries
Me
are,
too.
yeah, fries are definitely hard to lay off a lot of the times. One of the other things I do if I do order a burger is to leave off the bacon, if that's something
Mm-hmm.
that could come on it, because that's an easy way to get an extra healthy dose of salt.
Hmm. Yeah, and little changes like that do make big differences. Like, especially the bacon, like that nice thick cut bacon that comes on burgers at restaurants,
Mm-hmm.
probably has like 400 to 500 milligrams of sodium, honestly. So just
Right.
by making that one change, you cut that out.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a great suggestion.
Yeah. The small changes add up over time.
Hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So, do you also have in your ebook or elsewhere some recipes that are low in sodium?
Yeah, absolutely. So the ebook is specifically for people with kidney stones, and so all of the recipes sort of meet all the stuff that we've talked about. So they're not super high in added sugar or salt, or oxalate. So yeah, those recipes all definitely meet that criteria. I also just have some recipes on my website if you want to go check it out, and I'm always adding more over time. So if you just want to go to thekidneydietitian.org/recipes, you can find all of my recipes there. And since everyone with pretty much any kidney condition needs to be limiting salt, all my recipes are low in, as low in salt as possible. I just got some pretty good feedback on my low sodium sloppy Joe recipe, so if you want to go check that out, I heard that was delicious from actual people out in the world. I'm always very aware that I'm a dietitian and maybe I'm a little bit, my perception might be a little bit different, but I heard from actual people that this was delicious. So
Yeah.
go check that out.
Awesome. That sounds delicious.
Hmm.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. So is there anything else about sodium that we should make sure we talk about?
No, I think we kind of talked about ways to increase flavor. I suppose you really can't have a conversation about sodium without mentioning label reading, which we kind of talked about with restaurants, but it is literally impossible to follow a low sodium diet if you're not checking those food labels. Sort of like with the bacon on the burger, you can make something a lot lower sodium with one simple change. It goes the other way, right? Like you could be cooking at home and one ingredient can add 1,000 milligrams easily. So really be careful. And it's a lot of work at the beginning because if you're not used to checking labels, like it's in everything that you buy at the grocery store, everything that's in your pantry, you kind of have to check. But over time, we all tend to buy similar products from as we go on, you'll sort of know which ones are lower in sodium and know which ones to look out for. So really be careful that you're reading your food labels for sodium.
Yeah, definitely. And one
Hmm.
thing that's been helpful for me along the way has been actually keeping a list or like a menu of the things that I eat and sort of substituting them out one at a time for a little bit healthier options as I go along.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't know if anyone else feels the same way, but deciding what to eat every day, 3 times a day, is kind of like, I mean, it's an annoying thing to deal with, even though it's
Uh-huh.
not an actual problem. But it's just trying to come up with something every day to eat can be a bit of a chore. So if you keep your own sort of house menu, then you can have something to choose from and reference, and also update with healthier options as you come across them. So don't try and do it all at once, but baby steps.
Yeah. Yeah, we know from research that those small changes really promote lasting change. Like anyone can follow any sort of difficult diet for a week, right? But then it's going to be too much and you're likely going to give up. So working on small things, it really helps make those changes last. So,
Hmm.
for maybe you eat fast food 4 times a week now, and going down to three would be a huge change, right? So, you don't need to strive for perfection.
Right. Yeah. The best changes you make are the ones that you can actually keep. So if
Right,
they're
right. That's going to impact your health the most.
right.
Hmm.
Cool. So there's one question that we didn't get to last time from the Facebook group that I thought you could weigh in if you have any thoughts on.
Sure.
But somebody wanted to know about cranberry juice. They said they heard it was good for kidney health, um, and they wanted to hear your thoughts.
So yeah, so the cranberry juice I feel like is most known for its healthy quote benefits in urinary tract infections for UTIs,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that there is limited research that shows that cranberry juice is good for UTIs. So if that's an issue, then maybe it would be good. The research for kidney stones is very sparse, and there actually is some research that shows that cranberry juice could actually increase your risk of kidney stones, likely because it just has lots of sugar in it, like any juice does.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, so I do not recommend cranberry juice or really any juice if possible on a kidney stone diet just because of that sugar content.
Right. Um, One other quick thing I wanted to mention for people, if you do struggle with UTIs and you want to have cranberry juice for the benefits of it, the active ingredient in the cranberry juice that has the benefit, if it does have one, it's called D-mannose, and it's available like as a supplement. You can get it on Amazon or wherever. So if you're looking for the UTI benefits without the sugar, that might be something worth looking into.
Hmm.
Obviously, if you have an infection, go see a doctor. Don't let it go untreated. UTIs, if they
No,
go untreated, are very, very serious.
bad
But
stuff.
if that's something that you with your doctor decide is a good thing for you to incorporate in your health regimen, then that might be the way to go for that.
Hmm. I would say, if possible, try to find a supplement that has the USP label, the USP is sort of like a third party certifying body that says that that supplement
Mm-hmm.
is has what it says is in it, because supplements aren't regulated by the FDA, and so they can really put whatever they want in there, and they can say whatever they want is in there without actually putting it in there. So but
Mm-hmm.
that USP, if you can find one, is a good way to go, and that's true for any supplement that you might be taking.
Thank you for mentioning that. That's a
Hmm.
very important piece of the supplement puzzle too.
Yeah.
All right, Melanie, thank you so much. This episode is going to be very helpful for a lot of people, I hope. Also, for everyone listening, be sure to check out Melanie's website, her blog. It's the kidneydietitian.org. We'll have a link to that and also to her new ebook, which has 31-ish recipes
Yep.
for people that have kidney stones, right?
Yep. Calcium oxalate kidney stones specifically.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so we'll have a link to that also. If you have any questions for Melanie, definitely let me know. You can send me an email or you can send her a message, and we will probably end up doing an Instagram or Facebook Live or something like that where we answer questions from everyone, and we'll be sure to share some more of her recipes and get more resources out there for everyone. So Melanie, thank you again for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Vincent.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed that episode and want to leave a review, that would be awesome. If you have any questions or feedback, be sure to send me or Melanie a message on Facebook or on Instagram. You can send me an email at lowoxalatekitchen@gmail.com. Definitely check out that ebook if you're interested in that. There's going to be a link in the show notes. Like I said, it's lowoxalatekitchen.com/podcast, or you can find it on Melanie's blog at thekidneydietitian.org. If you have any recommendations for the podcast, anything you'd like to hear, any guests that you would like me to have on the show, definitely let me know. And thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.